Brass tacks, folks. This country is broken. Do we need to refound America to save it? What does that even mean? Let's get into it. I'm Nick Knudsen.
And I'm Marshall Herskovitz.
And welcome to The Rising. Today, we're taking on a very meaty and, dare I say, ambitious topic. But I'll start with a question. Does America feel like America to you? Masked paramilitary illegally snatching people off the streets. Courts packed with political loyalists. Newsrooms turned into outrage factories. Is this America? I mean, yes, literally it is. But the reason the country feels so broken is that we've strayed so far from some core ideals that have been a part of America's DNA since the country was founded. Do we need to refound America to save it from collapse? Can we overcome the chaos and get back to sanity? That's what we're here to talk about. Hey, Marshall, how are you?
Hey, Nick. Well, as you know...
How are you feeling, buddy? Yeah.
That's why we didn't have a show.
Yeah,
it was the first time I've ever actually had it, unbelievably. So
had COVID. Yep.
I feel much better, but my voice is terrible. So please forgive me, everybody.
But we'll get by.
I'm getting there.
I'm glad that you're back feeling more like yourself.
We'll see if the brain fog allows me to get through this, but I'm feeling good about it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, we're really excited about this conversation today, and I just want to give a shout out to the Danger Corps out there. You guys have been lighting up the phone lines and sending us emails, and we really appreciate that. Great thoughts, great messages. Keep them coming because it really helps us. It helps us to formulate what we talk about on a weekly basis. Call 503-212-4600 for the People's Hotline. You can leave up to a 5-minute message and you can remain anonymous. Or if you want to email us, you can send it to shout@thedangerousones.com. That all being said, let's get into today's episode, Marshall.
Also, one last thing.
Yeah.
We're filming this on Thursday, and everybody knows in 2 days, there are going to be mass protests around the country. And I think we all pray that they're taken in the spirit they're intended, which is these are people who love America and are just terribly afraid of what's happening to America. We hope they are peaceful, and we hope the authorities remain peaceful as well, because I know that the people out protesting intend to be peaceful. And our prayers go with everybody that this message is presented in the way it's intended.
Thank you for saying that. Yes, absolutely. So
I also, Nick, I wanted to say the other reason this doesn't feel like America anymore is we did not feel so divided 30 and 40 years ago. There were plenty of divisions in America, but, as we all remember, we talked about this before from our own childhoods, you could go out and have fun, and you could sort of think about your own self and your own life and things being okay. There was not this pervasive sense that America is in trouble that we have now had for 20 years. And we're going to talk about that because pretty much that's entirely based on an industry of rage that has intentionally torn the country apart. And that's one of the things we have to deal with if we're going to talk about refounding this country, because it turns out that if you talk about Democrats, and we're going to talk about all of America a little bit later, but Democrats, there's a kind of a silent majority of Democrats who agree on almost everything and who do not agree with a lot of the extreme messages that have been put out by the far left. And we're going to see that most Americans don't agree with the extremes on the far left or the far right, And I think that most Democrats are, really subscribe to the founding principles of this country. It's funny. I was reading that great quote by Lincoln the other day, and I'm going to get it wrong, but he basically says, I've never had a political feeling, and I love that idea, political feeling, that did not stem from the Declaration of Independence, which was just an extraordinary thing for the guy to say. And Lincoln plays a big role in this because, he wasn't a founder, but he was a person who deeply understood what the country was about. Just saying that and saying government of the people, for the people, by the people, is such an extraordinary definition of what America is. And tell me if you believe that government right now is for the people or by the people. It's just not happening. It hasn't been happening for a long time. And these are the things that lead us to believe, with all the shit that's going on, that we have to refound this country. We have to go back to the basic principles that allowed us to be a nation. And, you know, Nick knows this gets me into my rant about the Enlightenment, which I'm just going to take the time to do right now, because I think,
roll on, Marshall, roll on.
man, you know, too many people just skip right by the Enlightenment. They don't really get it. And by the way, it was a very complicated thing. It took 100 years, and a lot of it had to do with the scientific method and reason and all of that stuff. But politically speaking, the basis of the Enlightenment is right there in the Declaration of Independence. When they say all men, we now say all people are created equal. That was such an explosive idea that it set in motion what has essentially been a 300-year revolution. That when you say all people are created equal, meaning with equal rights, okay, what it means is that you cannot have dominion of one person over another person anymore. That was the implication of the Enlightenment. And that overthrew 10,000 years of human history. And a lot of folks say, oh, well, the Enlightenment was part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, okay? Yes, it was kind of in certain ways, but there was no moment in the history of the kings of Israel or the history of Christianity where anybody said, oh, all people are equal, and we're going to have a democracy, and we're going to, you know, and we're going to have liberty and freedom for everyone. That was just never, ever, ever a part of the way anything was governed. So when you had the Enlightenment and when you started the United States, what it meant was you were setting in motion an inevitable process where it was going to lead to the end of empires. It was going to lead to the end of slavery. It was going to lead to civil rights. It was going to lead to rights for women. These were all inevitable the minute you said all people are created equal. And it's so important to start with this because that's at the basis of our country. And I think, Nick, what you and I have talked about in the last few days is that you can look at America, the history of America, as this tension between the people who believed that we didn't go far enough yet in pursuing the Enlightenment and the people who didn't like the Enlightenment at all and wanted to go back to the way things were before, whether it was kings or dictators or slavery or whatever it is. And that's just basically been a constant throughout the whole thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned Lincoln as you said he wasn't a founder, right? Which is obviously true. But I would argue he is a refounder. And so I want to get into this concept of refounding the country. So you spoke of the founding, which was based on Enlightenment principles, and those principles have really driven the evolution of our democracy and our country over the last 250 years. But there have been, we're in a moment right now, I think, and as we were planning for this conversation, I was talking to Marshall and we had, I was trying to figure out, like, what is the weight of this moment? Like, how can we compare what's happening right now to what has happened in the past? And I kind of came up with two sort of really massive recalibrations of the American experiment. And I just wanted to talk about those really quick before we go into the rest of the conversation, because I think it contextualizes the rest of what we're going to talk about.
I think it's super important, actually. Yeah, I think it will give a lot of people hope, actually. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah. And there is hope in this because America's been through some shit and come out the other side of it. And we're going through some shit now. And that doesn't mean that we will come out the other side of that with our democracy intact. It's a moment of peril right now. But there is also reason to believe that because, like you're saying, our country is rooted in core principles: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, freedom, equality, that the country with the people leading can recalibrate. So the first, what I would call refounding of this country was in Lincoln's time. That's why he was really a refounder, right? Like because the country was founded on the idea that that people are free, but there was a baked-in problem in the document itself, in the Constitution and in the founding, because there was slavery in this country, and the principle of freedom and equality, there was a irreconcilable problem with then also enslaving humans. So it was, like you were saying, it was destined to correct itself, and it did. And Lincoln oversaw that. He called for a new birth of freedom, and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments tried to finish the work that the founders had left on the table. They gave us principles that were more perfect than they were willing to practice themselves, and that's that's what the Reconstruction period was about. Unfortunately, like you were saying, every time there's progress, there's a backlash, and obviously Reconstruction, we still feel it today. Reconstruction was never finished in the way that it needed to be, and redemption, Jim Crow, the rise of white terrorism. There was a tremendous strife that continued, right?
Yeah. By the way,
mm-hmm.
I keep coming back to Lincoln because there's a reason he's so important to America. That this guy, oh my God, he took us through the Civil War. And by the way, he was the most hated man in America during the Civil War. He was unbelievably unpopular. People called him a monkey, an idiot. I mean, it was amazing. But what Lincoln had as a matter of character, his sort of melancholy kindness, that sort of steady, tall, lanky kind of warmth that people felt, kept this country together. And it's very, very, very important to remember that Lincoln wasn't a guy who said, I hate my enemies, and I want them to die. If you want to talk about America, there are very few people who in character exemplify the best of this country more than Abraham Lincoln. When you talk about the man, this imperfect man, incredibly frustrated during the war, but we could not have done it with anyone else but him, I believe. And I think that's why he is so revered, because of these personal qualities that he had that are the opposite of the bombastic kind of political bullshit we have today. And this is part of the thing we've got to get back to, is the character of our leaders. So we'll get back to that.
Yeah.
So Nick,
great point.
By the way, I was so excited by this idea that there have been these refoundings before, because I was sitting there thinking, how do you refound America? Do you know what I mean? That's kind of insane. But it's been done. Okay.
Yeah.
And so the second one, happened in the 20th century, and actually took a very long time because it had different periods. It started with the Depression, but the Depression was just a crisis that set in motion a lot of horrible things that were already happening. The rise of fascism and Nazism and hatred in the 1930s, the collapse of our economic system. Once again, this figure came up, FDR, who, by the way, was not considered a very impressive guy before he became president. I mean, he just wasn't.
Right.
And again, we could not have made it through without this person with his particular kind of openness and confidence and, belief in the future. And, he set in motion certain things in the middle of the Depression. And I think, you and I talked about this, his idea of the four freedoms, Uh, um, the freedom, I can't remember it right now. It's like,
freedom from want,
yeah,
freedom from fear.
yeah, that was the
Uh,
one. Freedom
yep.
from fear.
Hmm.
My
Hmm.
God, freedom from fear. Can you imagine that? Could you imagine in America today being free of fear? It's like we are we are organized around fear, okay? Because people
Right.
have made us be that way. The notion that that's
Yeah.
a freedom we should have is something we must take back, and
Yeah.
we will take back. But we have to talk about how we're gonna fight these forces that impinge on us every single fucking day. Okay.
Yep.
So,
Exactly. There was this sort of double whammy of massive strife in FDR's reign as president. There was the Depression and there was World War II. And it was at a time when, because of the rise of fascism across the country and because of the economic collapse, people's trust and faith in both the economic system, but also
yeah,
in democracy itself,
yeah,
was really tested.
yeah,
And what Americans did by defeating fascism in World War II, and what FDR did with the New Deal, putting talking about this freedom from want and lifting up the importance of dignity, of human dignity, which was a huge change from the 1920s, where it was it was a lot like it is today, in terms of the economics of the day.
yeah,
Those two things together set in motion what was the completion of the second founding, because as those World War II black soldiers came back from World War II and weren't free at home, and women who had been working in factories during the war effort got sent back to the kitchen,
yeah,
and the strife of those times set in motion what became the civil rights era,
right.
and we had another absolutely amazing leader along the lines of Lincoln and FDR and Martin Luther King,
Yeah,
who really helped the country sort of complete the second founding, by both as a social movement, but also from a legislative standpoint, and like fixing, using legislative procedure and leadership to give
by the
some
way,
people in the country what they'd never had.
this is just what I was gonna say, that, you know, when you talk about all people created equal, yes, Black people, women, but also the world order created after World War II that allowed the greatest middle class in history to be created. That's all people created equal. That's for the first time working people in America had a chance to really create their own future. That's we talk about this again and again and again. What did it mean to be able to buy a house on one income and two cars and raise your kids and afford your health care and all the things that, the 1950s, for all of their evils in terms of cultural problems, had a lower level of income inequality than at any time in the history of our country. And here we are right now back in another gilded age. And
Yeah,
again, when we talk about refounding, we're talking about going back to these principles. What did they do in the 1950s that allowed them to raise up a middle class that had never been seen in the world before? So that's one of the things we have to talk about is
yeah.
how do you find these things from the past and bring them forward and say, this is the world we want to have now?
Absolutely. And so now I guess what we're saying to all of you who are watching and listening is that we are at the beginning of the third refounding of the United States of America.
Yeah,
That there was the Civil War, massive um, you know terrible situation in this country that led to Reconstruction and a redefinition of equality. There was the period of the 30s to the 60s that, again, redefined the dignity of citizens and raised up the importance of dignity of citizens, both from an economic standpoint and from a racial and social justice standpoint.
Yep.
And now, we talked about in our last episode the rise of neoliberalism with the Reagan era, and that basically took over, our as a core philosophy, where greed is king, and it's shareholders over people, and the result is where we are today. And yes, we're facing tyranny for the first time again since the founders originally, wrote the Declaration of Independence, and that's not great. But the underlying dynamic that was happening really started 45 years ago, and
That's right.
and so now and we'll circle back to this at the end of the show today, but as we're thinking about what that third refounding is going to look like, what we have to we want to go back to those founding principles and think, what does freedom mean now, like in the context of a much smaller world, a world that's rife with information and disinformation, where truth seems optional, and so we'll talk about that.
So this brings us to this question of how did we get here today, and what role does information, disinformation, the industry of rage play in this? And my feeling is it's an overwhelming role, and it's something we've never faced before in the same way. I mean, look, back in the 19th century, there were 1,000 different newspapers with 1,000 different points of view, but they did
True.
not have the same impact that social media has today or television news has today, working together in concert. And what we've had right now is 30 years of bombardment of the American people 24/7 by
Yep.
these voices saying, hate other Americans. They're bad. They're destroying America. They're taking away what's good about America. And you can't survive that as a nation if that's going to happen for 35 years. And by the way, it's on both sides. Let's face it. And by the way, I talk to a lot of liberals who say to me, we can't be responsible for the disinformation of the right, whether it's stuff about race or stuff about trans or whatever we want to talk about. These are small problems that the right blows up into something big. But the problem is they've blown them up. Kamala Harris lost the election in Pennsylvania because of anti-trans ads. Okay. So however you think it's fair or not fair that this became a problem, it's now our problem. Okay. And so we can talk all day about what the right has done, what the Republicans have done, where this tyranny has come from. But mostly what they're doing is they are taking advantage of things that the left has done in the past 30 years that most Democrats don't even agree with, but have allowed because they were nice, because they, didn't want to create discord, because they were afraid of being yelled at for whatever reason. Okay. Part of the refounding right now is Democrats have to stand up for what they actually believe in, not for the things that the people in the extreme left believe in, whether it's the policing of language, or the, or some of the more extreme ways in which people were told how they must live. Okay. When in fact, part of America is you live the way you want to live. Live and let live. It's a free country. That's a big part of America. And when you go on college campuses and you find out that a majority of the kids don't actually believe in free speech anymore, you have to say, okay, this is a problem on the left. And it's something that every Democrat I know believes absolutely in free speech. Okay. So we've allowed this to happen. And it's one of the things we have to deal with. Okay. And just like we have to deal with the extremism on the right.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What you're talking about, the extremism on the right is partisan political, right?
Yeah.
I think some of the things that you're talking about as extremism on the left are much more cultural, and don't really aren't as connected. They're connected to politics because the right makes them connected to politics, because that's how they can make people really angry. But from a legislative standpoint, or from that angle, it's not like Democrats have been out policing language as a party.
This is such an interesting thing to talk about, as a matter of fact, because it is true that the Democrats, with some exceptions, but mostly, I agree, this was entirely cultural. And it's not like there was some committee somewhere, in Amherst, Massachusetts, deciding exactly how Democrats were supposed to talk or what the rules were or anything like that. It really was a kind of, I don't want to use the word hive mind, because it's a pejorative that Musk uses, but there is a way in which these things spread in a cultural way, but they had enormous influence. Mark Andreessen, who I think most people know is a big investor. He's a guy who was nominally a liberal before, but voted for Trump this time. I got a lot of problems with Mark Andreessen, but he talks very interestingly about what his company became like starting in 2018 and moving into the early 2020s, and how, a lot of the things that have been taught in universities for 30 years that were essentially Marxist, let's face it, they were completely anti-capitalist, completely anti-West. They basically said that all human beings should be divided among the oppressed and the oppressors are evil and the oppressed are good. And okay, this is what people learned in top universities for 30 years. But starting in the teens, for the first time, these kids came out of universities and said, you know what, I'm not giving up that stuff. That's what I believe, okay? And they almost took over the New York Times newsroom in 2020, and that was a big deal. And Andreessen talks about how at his company, which is the most capitalist company in the world, he said 20% of the people who worked there truly hated capitalism and wanted capitalism to end. Now, you could ask, why didn't you fire them? But what he said,
why did they go work there in the first place?
Well, right. But and why did they? Okay, but the point is, what he was saying is that they so intimidated 60% of the other people that that 60% of them went along, and you had 80% of his employees saying things and believing things and advocating for things that didn't allow him to run his company anymore. And I get it. I think that was a real problem. I think Democrats have to contend with the fact that starting in 2015 and really, around the murder of George Floyd and the things that happened in the year or two afterwards, that there was this sense of overreach by the left and by Democrats that, and a lot of things were said at that time that people now regret, whether it's defund the police and a lot of other things that were not actually the things that most Democrats believed, okay? And I think what we want to understand is that most Democrats believe in what I would call common sense and common decency, and that they believe these things are real. They believe these problems are real. They believe these problems must be solved, but they don't believe in illiberal solutions to problems that are in a liberal democracy. And I think that's, again, what we're talking about is how do you get back to the core principles that allow us to actually solve the problems as opposed to just create more political problems?
I mean, I would contend that the problem wasn't really any of those ideas coming out of universities or businesses or anything, but that it was the weaponization of those cultural movements by the right, using the levers of technology and social media and disinformation that really kind of screwed everything up. So I went to college during that time period that you were talking about. I heard all those messages about the oppressed and the oppressors and
Yeah, but you're
and all
old.
that. Hey, but I came out of it
Yeah.
understanding that that there was some truth to that.
Yeah.
It wasn't the truth, but it was an important perspective to
Yeah.
hear, and it didn't turn me into a radical or whatever. So I don't know. I guess I just say underscoring all of this is not that ideas are bad or that cultural movements are bad, but it's the fact that bad actors on the right are able to weaponize that information and enrage people in ways that they shouldn't be.
Here's the thing.
Instead of having a cultural dialogue about it, where
Right.
we have fucking
Right.
masked ICE agents tackling people in the streets.
I mean, here's the thing. I can agree with you and say absolutely the major problem in this country has been the weaponization of these sorts of things. And I can also say that many, many, many people were harmed by things the left did. I mean, thousands of people were canceled and lost their jobs and lost their careers, and some of them committed suicide. That happened. Okay, it's that's a real thing. And there are a lot of other.
I'm no fan of cancel culture.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing is there
I'm not
was
out here defending that.
no that the thing is even if look we're sitting here we're liberals, okay, we're never going to say the left ruined America. What I mean? That's not the point. But what I want to say is that unless the overall left, and what I forget that, unless the Democrats, okay, are willing to take responsibility for the things they did that were wrong or overstepped or illiberal, then it's never going to get better because at the same time, we understand that, if you've ever watched libs of TikTok, which is a very interesting thing to watch, okay, because it's really just videos of ultra liberal people being really stupid and saying really stupid things, okay?
Right.
And,
that's what I'm talking about, the weaponization of.
What's that?
Yeah. That's what I meant by like the weaponization,
so
right? Yeah.
You're always going to find somebody somewhere who's saying something really stupid. And what you're going to have is this enormous apparatus on the right that's going to take that thing and say, see, all those Democrats, they're all crazy. They're all bad. Okay, that's always going to happen. So we need a process of acknowledging and correcting the mistakes that Democrats have made and not ignoring them and not saying they never happened, but at the same time moving forward and saying that's not what ruined this country. Okay, that's the thing about moving forward. And I think part of this is part of the thing about the industry of rage is that it goes beyond just media, okay? The incentives in politics are the same. The incentives in politics are to be extreme, and not just extreme, but to be divisive. The incentive for an elected representative, whether they Democrat or Republican, is to say those people on the other side are bad, they're evil, is to keep the problem going instead of solving the problem, okay? And I think Democrats have to just stop. They just have to fucking stop. And part of that is about money, and we'll get to that, okay? But I think it's time we understand that, here we are in this supposedly divided nation where everybody feels so shitty, okay? And, we're about to be in a civil war. And when you look at polling, it's unbelievable. It's extraordinary. There's actually almost complete agreement across the board of most Americans, 70% of Americans, on almost every issue you can name, okay? And we should talk about them because it's interesting when you get into the specifics of it, okay? Abortion, 65% believe in abortion, okay? Guns, 80% believe we should have more restrictions on guns. Climate change, depending on how you ask the question, 65 to 75% say, yes, we need to do more. Trans athletes in female sports, 30% agree that they should have that. Okay. By the way, even among Democrats, only 34% of Democrats believe that you should have trans athletes in female sports. Sorry, that's just not going to happen now. Okay. And that's an interesting question we're going to get into in a later episode about these cultural issues. Taxing the rich. 80% of Americans, even a majority of Republicans, think we should tax the rich more. Okay. It's, the truth is, when you look at where America is right now, what Americans believe in terms of policy is almost exactly what Democrats stand for. And you have to ask yourself, why don't Democrats win elections across the board besides gerrymandering? I understand that there's a lot of corruption and voter suppression. But even without that, why are we not winning elections? Okay. This is so important that Democrats need to figure out their own weaknesses. And a lot of that has to do with the kind of refounding we're talking about, where Democrats are much clearer about what they stand for, that they are American values, core American values.
So, Marshall, you have mentioned to me this concept of we need an insurgency of the sane. What do you mean by that?
Okay. Okay. The Democrats are in free fall right now. They don't know what they're doing. Okay. And there are various insurgencies among the Democrats right now. There's an insurgency of progressives and socialists. And, a lot of people think that we would win if we were even more progressive. And I mean, the polling just doesn't show that at all and never has. Okay. What we need is, yes, an insurgency of the sane, of the reasonable, because what has America become? It's become insane and unreasonable, and people are so goddamn sick of it. Across the board, they're sick of it. They're desperately waiting for actual leaders to stand up and say, this is what we believe. This is what we're going to do. It's a kind of an energy that, that needs to be put out. It's, it's interesting. The word is masculine, okay, and it hasn't done anything to do with men and women. You could use Jung's idea of anima and animus, okay, but the Democrats have just lost the ability to just stand up in a strong way and say, no, this is what we're going to do. This is what we believe in. This is what we're confident about. Okay, look at how they have failed in these months. Look how weak they all look. That there has to be a kind of a grit and a sort of a backbone behind what we believe. These are our fundamental beliefs, and we are going to move forward with this, okay? And so let's talk about what that means, okay? I mean, let's talk about what the specifics of that are. That an insurgency of the sane means that we acknowledge that Americans have been totally screwed over by our economic system for 45 years. So sane does not mean moderate or centrist, okay? Yep. We have to destroy neoliberalism. That's not the same as destroying capitalism. That's not socialism. Right. That's not saying we're going to get rid of all billionaires and or tax people to death. That's not the idea. What we want, in fact, is a very strong, full-throated, belief that we want more Americans to get rich. We want more Americans to have opportunities. We want more Americans to be able to create their own dreams. And that's just gone now. I mean, you look across this country and it's just blasted. People just think they can't have dreams. Okay.
No, we're just all trying to survive at this point.
Just trying to survive. Exactly. We have to say, no, survival's not good enough. Okay. But at the same time, as a country, we have to say, live and let live, okay? That the conservatives are not going away. There's this weird fantasy in America on each side that those other bad people are just going to go away one day and disappear. That's not going to happen. Half of America is going to think that, we should go back to the way things were, and half of America is going to say, no, we have to move forward, okay? So we have to find a way to say, we're going to make America fairer. We're going to make America economically fairer. We're going to, we're going to make stock buybacks illegal. We're going to tax these goddamn, private equity companies that buy up 45% of the houses that are on the market in order to jack up the price. You know what? You're going to pay 100% tax on those houses. We can do that. That's not central planning. That's not socialism. That's us saying you must serve the public good. Okay. So that's what an insurgency of the sane is beginning to look like. There's more stuff. Trump has made it really clear what we have to do in a lot of other ways. We have to reestablish the rule of law. And by reestablishing it, it means we have to be in a position where we can pass laws that make it really clear that you cannot do what he's doing. Okay. So we have to reestablish core constitutional principles of due process, of separation of powers. There are so many aspects right now that are just being knocked down right and left. And Democrats have to say, no, you're not going to do that. And anybody who wants to stop that from happening, join us, because that's going to be job one. A lot of what I'm saying is cultural. It's not just we need more regulation or we need more laws.
Right.
We need a reform movement in America that says we have to have these basic values and we have to adhere to these basic values. I was talking with a friend and we did this thought experiment of what would have happened in 1958. Let's say just science fiction, okay, an alternate universe. In 1958, Facebook existed. Mark Zuckerberg had created Facebook. Facebook had 1 billion, followers, members, users, okay? And let's say, but in 1958, it came out that Mark Zuckerberg had hired addiction experts to get the children and the teenagers of our country addicted to the site so that they stayed on the site to the point where it destroyed their mental health and their schoolwork, okay? And it got young people to go deeper and deeper into radicalization, okay? Let's say that came out in 1958 instead of now. I guarantee you, in 1958, he would have had to resign by the next day. That would have been absolutely unacceptable for the leader of a major company to do something as unbelievably fucked up an asshole as that, okay? So why did we have values in 1958? Even we were doing a lot of crappy things, okay? I'm not whitewashing 1958, but we had some sense of right and wrong in 1958, okay? We need that back right now. This minute, we need it right back. The Democrats need to say character counts. That used to be a Republican thing. Not anymore. That's an American thing. It's always been an American thing. Family counts, community counts, character counts. That's part of standing up and being strong.
Well, and it's also about this sort of, like we were talking about at the beginning, with the founding principles and the refounding of America. In this refounding, we're going to have to, a lot of the basis for Zuckerberg being able to do what he does and Musk being able to do what he does is they lean on free speech. Oh, it's free speech, and what we need the party and we need as a society to re-embrace the idea of freedom and re-evaluate it based on the rise of technology and the rise of disinformation. What about my freedom to not be manipulated intentionally? Like, how does that? Why is that less important than your freedom of speech? I don't think it is.
It's not,
because we're all being manipulated on a daily basis.
Yeah, you can't commit fraud in this country. I mean, there are limits on free speech. By the way, this is such a thorny issue, and we're probably going to do a whole episode on this about the difference between free speech and the public square. But look, we're not going to get into that right now because it will kill us and this will end up being 2 hours long. But yes, the point is what we have is 2 generations of people who think that they can get rich by destroying the country, and they don't care what they do to people, all right? That's what has to stop. That has to be a cultural reform movement to say, you know what? You can't get away with not caring what happens to people. We're done with that now. We're done with you. That's where we have to go.
And we need that kind of muscular sort of positioning coming out of leaders. We need our JFK, our Lincoln, our FDR, our MLK, of
Right.
today's age. We really do. But I wager that when that person rises, they are going to lean heavily on core American principles and reframing those American principles in a way that really resonates with a lot of Americans who are very upset with what's happening in the country right now.
Yeah. I mean, Nick, I'm hopeful because I think Americans themselves are still the way they always were. I know we have to end, and I want to end just with this memory that when 9/11 happened, I remember that I had become very. Let me start this again. Okay. When 9/11 happened, I remember that I had become very sort of pessimistic about the American character at that point. I thought that we had become soft and self-interested and all the things that we're talking about right now. Okay. And one of the amazing things about that day that will stay with me for the rest of my life is that in all 3 places, thousands of regular people instantly ran into danger and sacrificed their lives in a lot of cases, okay, and sacrificed their health. They just did it. It was this astonishing sort of proof that the character of America was completely undamaged. You just ripped that thing off, and there were all those people, okay? Yeah. Well, it's 25 years later, and I still think America is America. And I still think the basic character of America is decent and good and wants there to be a better world for their children. And I think they're going to join us if the Democrats can put forward a message that fits with how people want to see themselves in the world and in their future and their family and their future, then we're going to get to a better place.
Well, here's hoping. Thank you so much, Marshall. This very interesting conversation, and I think we will carry a lot of these ideas forward into future episodes. Quick programming note for everybody: we are not going to have a show next week for a variety of reasons. Sorry about that, but we will be back 2 weeks from now. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Be sure to go to www.thedangerousones.com. That'll kick you over to our Substack. And today's post, you'll find a deeper dive into some of the stuff that we talked about today, as well as there are some actions there that you can take to help fight authoritarianism. While you're there, you can become a paid subscriber. That would be great. If you want to support the show in another way, you can click the QR code or scan the QR code on your screen, or click the link in the description. It helps us out so much. Also in the description, we have links to all the major audio podcast platforms. Please go subscribe to The Rising on those platforms as well. Thank you again for joining us. And remember, if we think big, if we meet fear with courage, and if we build community, we can all rise together. Bye-bye.